So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris McCabe. I'm a Professor of Health Economics at the University of Alberta and Chief Executive of the Institute of Health Economics. I'm one of the investigators on the One Society network. And it is my pleasure to welcome our presenters today, Joanne Relf-Eckstein, Jake Clarkson, Cheryl Waldner, and Vic Adamovich, talking to us about the agriculture theme of the webinar. So I'm not sure who's talking first, but I will get out of the way and hand over to whoever is going to talk first.
Hi, everybody. My name is Vic Adamovich. I'm one of the investigators as well in the One Society Network. I'm also professor and vice dean of the Faculty of Agricultural Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta. I'll be the moderator today, so I'm not going to say anything that's interesting. The others will. So welcome to the One Society Network Seminar Series. Quick background on One Society Network for those that aren't familiar with it. It's one of a number of the emerging infectious disease modeling networks. Network consists of researchers across Canada working to understand broad multi-sectoral impacts of infectious diseases like COVID-19 and public health policies. So these introductory seminars give an overview of the dynamic connections between pandemics and the diverse aspects of today's society. A couple of housekeeping rules. So throughout the seminar, participants will be muted, but feel free to use the chat. I'll try to monitor the chat if there are some questions that perhaps need to be answered mid-flow. If you want to submit your questions, use that Q&A function. And then at the end of the session, we'll present those questions and our speakers will provide a response. So really pleased today. Our session is entitled COVID-19 and the Canadian Cattle Beef Production System, developing a causal loop diagram for modeling the unstructured problem of the pandemic. Today's presenters are Dr. Cheryl Waldner and Joanne Relf-Eckstein. So let me do a brief overview of their backgrounds. Cheryl Waldner is a professor of epidemiology at the University of Saskatchewan and NSERC Beef Cattle Research Council Senior Industrial Research Chair in One Health and Production Limiting Disease, interested in antimicrobial use and resistance, as well as prevention and control of infectious diseases. Current research is focused on system science tools, system dynamics, agent-based methods to understand rapid diagnostics and infection prevention measures on the transmission of infectious disease among livestock. Dr. Waldner has more than 250 peer-reviewed publications, an H-index of 41, and more than 6,100 citations. She's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences in recognition of her contributions to human and animal health. Joanne Relf-Eckstein is a professional agrologist, born and raised, operated a mixed operation family farm in southeastern Saskatchewan, holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Public Policy from the Johnson Sharama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan, and graduated from the NSERC One Health Leadership Program, integrated training program in infectious disease. Current work is focused on the management of producer organizations and academic research supporting the use of qualitative and systems thinking to understand the impact of rapid diagnostics and infection prevention measures on the transmission of infectious disease. Ms. Relf-Eckstein has a policy and agriculture research publications in peer-reviewed journals, a research interest index of 90.4 and 119 citations. So with that, as a brief introduction, I'm really pleased to hand it over to Cheryl and Joanne and look forward to the talk.
In today's webinar, we're going to give you an overview of Canada's beef production system, its contributions to Canadian society, and the disruption to the meat supply chain because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Rather than trying to measure the impact of COVID-19 on all aspects of the agriculture sector, we have decided to focus on the beef supply chain. Why beef? Well, as you will see from the material that Joanne is going to present, there are some very real lessons to be learned about the complexities of the interrelationships within the system. And there were very significant impacts of employee illness and absenteeism at the meat processing plants in Canada. Our webinar begins with how livestock production and particularly the beef industry fits within the One Society network. Our methodology is primarily qualitative, and descriptive rather than quantitative and analytical for the study, because our focus is on capturing the nonlinear relationships among people, processes, and the places that are involved in Canada's agriculture and food supply chain. Our research leverages a number of system science tools. The primary output from this project is going to be a causal loop diagram that could be integrated into the OSN modeling work. Our goal is primarily providing policymakers a whole society perspective, including critical examples from the agriculture industry. The findings of the study are going to inform policy responses and scenario planning to minimize the risks should we be faced with another highly transmissible disease affecting the agriculture and food system in Canada. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Joanne, who is the primary lead on this work, and she'll provide an overview of this important story.
Thank you, Cheryl. On March 5th, the first positive case of COVID-19 was detected in Alberta. It wasn't very much longer that the cases were detected at our meat processing plants. 3 of the processing plants for Canada in Alberta account for 85% of our meat processing for Canada. These 3 plants shut down and they reduced shifts. But at the end of the day, it was the employees who were ill. And we actually had the distinction of the largest single outbreak in Canada. And that first one was in April. And then the second largest outbreak occurred a bit later on. From the time of first infection, March 27th in Balzac, Alberta, April 6th in High River, and in Brooks, Alberta on April 12th. These 3 plants employed 5,000 employees approximately. They processed 8,500 head of cattle per day. In addition, COVID spilled over into the Alberta feedlots. At the height of the cases, there was 1,167 cases associated with the largest plant in Canada at High River, and 36 at the smaller plant at Balzac, and 650 at the Brooks plant. Similarly, in other parts of the world, the meat processing plants were some of the highest concentrated outbreaks in the first wave of COVID-19. This photo is courtesy of one of our colleagues, Aaron J. Banerjee, and it gives us an idea of the damage that this organism can cause for us. It is transmitted by droplets and aerosol. There's many publications that are suggesting that we are dealing with a wicked or a unstructured or ill-defined problem. COVID-19 is creating variants as we go forward, and now we're getting into the discourse of long COVID. This is a problem for policy as well as everyone across society. March 11th, the World Health Organization declared it the official pandemic, and as of May 10th, we're looking at 6.2 million deaths and 517 million confirmed cases. The food supply chain has been affected. The Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, OECD, declared it officially on October 20th. COVID-19 was a shock to our food systems and our supply chains. It disrupted meat processing plants around the world. The most affected industries were beef, poultry, and hog. As far as COVID-19 in Canada, specific to the food supply chain, we saw that the impact at the processing plants involved the people in the center of the picture was the cause of the ripple effect in all directions, upward and downward of the supply chain. But it also affected the transportation of our processed goods, as well as our live exports and food products, exports and domestic. Thus, the idea for One Society Network was born. How do we do a better job of understanding the pandemic, and how can we move forward to planning in the eventuality of another zoonotic disease that may be affecting our food system? Canada's agriculture sector is extremely important to the Canadian economy. We're a large country. We grow food for the world. We always have, and we always will. We've got good soil, we've got water, we've got a climate that is less than desirable at times, but the fact is we do a very good job at growing good quality food products, both plant and animal-based, and fisheries. Agriculture's contribution to the economy cannot be denied. 139.3 billion for our country is something to be extremely proud of, and we're the world's fifth largest exporter. 2.1 million people are employed in the agriculture sector. And when you break it down by sector or within the sectors, there's the 39.8 billion for primary agriculture through to 21.1 billion for food service contribution to GDP. Our food exports in 2020 are valued at 74 billion, and our household food expenditures was a shocking 243 billion. Within the food sector, primary agriculture in Canada employs a great many people. However, it is noticed that the food service industry is almost 4 times as much as primary. Narrowing it down a bit further to the beef sector, it alone contributes for 228,000 jobs in Canada. The Canadian Cattle Association suggests that 3.56 are created elsewhere in the economy for every 1 job in the beef sector. Looking to Agriculture Canada for the quick facts on beef. Canada, 12.3 million cattle and calves every year on our Canadian farms and ranches. 40% of those inventories are held in the province of Alberta. The other 2 prairie provinces account for a large percentage as well. At our plants, which again, primarily based in Alberta, 80% of our processing is done there. 3.24 million cattle per year are handled and 212,000 calves. These are in federally and provincially inspected establishments. Those plants process our cattle and our calves into 1.28 million tons of beef. We export our products as processed meat, and as well, we do have live exports, primarily to the United States. 670,000 head is about an average, according to the Cattle Association. And the $3.26 billion of our processed beef and veal are exported. Statistics Canada has come up with an interactive dashboard, and for each of the icons displayed on our screen, there is a link to the current statistics. So we could click on production, that will take you to the current statistics. This is really a very valuable tool in modeling things going forward. As you can see, it's a fairly interconnected chain, and starting from production right through to distribution. Now I will play a video that's been provided to us by the Canadian Cattle Association. So sit back, and I hope you've eaten your supper or lunch, because you might get hungry after this.
Canada has one of the healthiest national cattle herds and one of the most wholesome beef products in the world because its land is so well suited for cattle production. Home to the world's most endangered ecosystem, Canada's temperate grasslands depend on ranchers and cattle for its very survival. Let's take a closer look at how those beautiful steaks you enjoy actually get to your plate. The process starts on the ranch. The ranchers raise mother cows that are usually bred throughout the spring and summer. Their calves are then born the following spring. Once a calf is born, it's given an ear tag that tracks the animal as it moves throughout the system. The cow and calf are raised on the land together with the rest of the herd. The calves stay with the cows, drinking their milk and eating grass. This grazing helps to keep Canada's grasslands healthy, providing homes for many species of endangered wildlife, as well as ensuring that carbon remains sequestered in the soil by not cultivating the land. Once calves reach 6 to 10 months of age and typically 500 to 800 pounds in weight, they're ready to eat only grass and hay, and they're weaned from their mothers. Some are kept for breeding, and the rest move on to the backgrounding phase, where the weaned calves continue to grow by grazing on fields with access to shelter, plenty of grass and water, and professionals to care for their health. A small percentage of cattle in Canada are grass-finished, which means they spent their entire lives on pasture, while grain-finished cattle are also raised on pasture and then moved to a feedlot for the finishing process. The focus at this stage is weight gain, nutrition, and animal care. Cattle will eat a diet of forages and grains, such as barley or corn, that produces tender, marbled beef. No matter which way they're finished, at least 80% of the feed cattle eat during their lifetime comes from grass-based forage. Cattle also act as upcyclers and use grains and crops that humans are not able to consume. In some cases, cattle can also upcycle food products that were intended for human consumption but didn't make it onto grocery store shelves for a variety of reasons. Uncooked French fries can be fed to cattle as part of a balanced feed ration instead of sending them to a landfill. Even after donations to local food banks, there can be an excess of product with nowhere to go. Cattle will typically spend anywhere from 60 to 200 days in the feedlot until they've reached the optimal weight for being sold to the meatpacking plant. At the plant, inspectors check the quality of the meat to ensure it is safe, and graders assess different characteristics to give the meat a grade of A, AA, AAA, or prime. Once the beef is boxed and ready for consumption, it moves into distribution, where Canadians get to enjoy it with their friends and family, in restaurants and in their homes. One thing we're starting to learn is just how complex and interdependent our food systems and supply chains really are, and how important it is to appreciate the many hands that work together to get our food to the grocery store each and every day.
That's a lovely overview of our Canadian cattle production system, and thanks to our colleagues at Canadian Cattlemen's Association for providing that. I'm going to give you a breakdown of the production cycle. So on our cow-calf operations, that's where everything starts. And we've got the two time periods that Statistics Canada breaks down, so January and July, and then broken it down into three segments of the production. So cow-calf, feeder and stalker, which is defined as cows fed on a low energy ration, hay, pasture, or on feeding operations, which are prominent again in Alberta. So of the 6.6 million animals on our cow-calf operation, as you can see, the prairie provinces have the majority by far of our animals in Canada. And similarly, the feeder and stalker, and as well the feeding operations, so the feedlots. Alberta is definitely the land of cattle and beef, and therefore a lot of the operations for the processing are also centralized in Alberta, just for the sheer logistics of the transportation and the feeding and the moving of the animals. Eastern Canada, however, does have its share, and it was very good for the Canadian situation, because in the case of COVID-19, when our Alberta processing plants, meatpacking plants had to start shutting down operations, cattle started moving to the eastern provinces for processing there. When the second wave of COVID hit the eastern provinces, then they too had a backlog of animal. So here we can see a longitudinal look at the actual impact of the lockdown and the plant closures. So looking at specifically within the red block, and as I mentioned at the beginning, you're looking at the beginning of March and April from when the cases first started appearing at our three main processing plants. When those plants shut down, all those animals that were ready at the feedlot to reach their target weight before they went into processing were held. And that became a problem, because how do you keep that amount of cattle healthy and fed without gaining too much? So this was a problem, and it cost the feedlots an incredible amount of money. And you can see here, like I said, we're looking at the number of cattle slaughtered, the massive drop that we had. However, also note the increase. So they were quite amazing at how they were able to come back. And again, this is the Canadian numbers. Because of the movement from west to east when we could no longer handle what we had in our backlog, and with increased exports of live animals to the United States, the system proved to be adaptive and resilient. Those are very important things to remember. Yes, we have a few plants, it's concentrated in industry, but they are very efficient economically, and they did a remarkable job. In the United States, a different discourse is emerging. The plants are much the same, but the desire is to have more and smaller plants. Here, again in Canada, I call it our pressure relief valve. We shipped west to east when we needed to. Cattle prices were also impacted, as well as the consumer prices. And that's got a lot to do with the food preferences that we saw at the grocery store with the closing of the hotel and restaurant industry. And the cattle prices then, as well as the cattle aren't moving, yes, you can imagine the prices decreased, but they did rebound. So again, similar look, again, the massive drop in the slaughter and processing. And then it started, this graph ends towards the end of July. The other thing important to note is that the first phase caused a huge impact to those processing plants, but it still had a ripple effect in the second phase and the third phase, and there's still employees being impacted. And this happened also in Ontario and Quebec, not just Alberta. This data is courtesy of our colleagues at CanFax Research, part of the Canadian Cattle Association. And these numbers basically give a snapshot by week of the scale of the difference between the West federally inspected plants and the West non-federally inspected plants. So this doesn't include Eastern Canada, but this does specifically account for the majority, almost all of the operations that are located in the three highlighted arrows. So Balzac, High River, and Brooks. The cost of feeding the cattle is something that is just, it's beyond our comprehension. $61 million paid by the feedlots to keep those animals that were at the feedlots in stasis alive and healthy. The price of beef did show different trends. And what was interesting is if we look, for example, at right here and highlighted in the blue, the increased price for stewing beef, again, a response for the demand, the consumers shifting their preferences, versus steak, which the prices started dropping off quite a bit as the high-end or the food and retail industry suffered. And the ground beef price it dropped off a bit, but it went up a little bit towards June. And then, of course, the prime roast started going down. Again, it's more of an expensive cut that is served in the restaurant industry. I wanted to bring up the transportation of our beef products because that is also a pillar within the One Society network. It was interesting to note that the shift between the different forms of transportation. So with, again, this is just the beef products, not live animals. So our imports were up by truck quite substantially, 2020 versus 2019. So in 2020, 7 million more kilos were imported by truck, by rail, by boat, and by plane. Whereas our exports, we dropped off on our exports. And again, this is beef products, not live animals going to the United States. Rail was up for our exports. And it was interesting to note that, like every other thing that's involved in container shipping by boat, our exports dropped dramatically 1 year to the next. And the planes carried more of our exported food across the oceans. Take-home points that we want to leave you with today is the meat processing plants are a vital component to our Canadian and international food supply chain. There's literature now being published on the contact tracing of how the unique environments in both the processing plants and the feedlots created that perfect environment for that virus to spread by aerosols. The plants are cool, there's less intake of fresh air. There's close working quarters. It's an assembly line. That is the reality that we face for today's commercial production, food production system. If we want cheap, affordable food, this is why you can get it, because we have these efficient systems in place. But it is all about people and the conditions that they work in. The owners and the managers of these plants, they did everything that we thought would help protect their employees. And it's that critical environment that we're seeing in the literature in Germany, in France, and as well as in the United States. The literature is not yet out about the Canadian conditions right at the plant. But the other extremely important factor In all of the countries that I've mentioned, foreign-born workers, communication challenges when you have to communicate something about vaccines or about the disease transmission. Those temporary foreign workers in Canada, as well as the foreign workers in Germany and France, share housing. That disease is spread not just at the plant, but to their family units. This is also what they're reporting in the United States. So on the left-hand side, there's reminders. So you've got the relative humidity, you've got the air circulation, you've got the humidity, you've got as well the close working conditions. These are all very important things that we've learned. And in some cases, they even have the vaccination clinics eventually set up for the feedlots as well as at the processing plants. So the key to remember, temporary foreign worker programs, communications, and then backing it up to the environment that just creates that beautiful environment for the coronavirus, COVID-19, to spread. So our research, we wanted to integrate our agriculture perspective into the larger One Society model. And as Cheryl explained at the beginning, we've taken a qualitative approach because the industry statistics, as we noted from Statistics Canada, they come on the 6-month basis, so the January to July for the cattle numbers and the stocks and flows, so that data isn't always as readily available as we would like to think. But having a broader picture is what our aim is, to show policymakers all those connections that make the system work, but also expose our vulnerabilities. So this is a schematic of basically what we learned from the Canadian Cattlemen's Association video. Again, I'm not going to go over this to save time, but you can see how the differences between the prices between 2019 and 2020. So again, in 2020, we were about from March, April, May, we were just in the first phase of the pandemic. Slaughter numbers are down. The wholesalers' margins actually were up, which is interesting. Consumer prices were up. Keep this image in mind, but I also want you to think of the ripple effect. So the point of infections and the problems where the people were concentrated the most were our processing plants. But the ripple effect spread throughout the entire economy. So our research plan, we're specifically looking at the first wave because that was the major impact on the processing plants. We did a rapid review of the literature back in 2021, and there really wasn't a lot out there. Well, it was theory more than it was evidence. Now we're starting to see the evidence come from the impact on the food supply chain and specifically the meat plants as the contact tracing data becomes available. Both Cheryl and I come from the agriculture world. We know that it is nonlinear, and we know that it is a system, and there's so many interconnecting factors at play. This is a real passion for myself to communicate that to policymakers and to those who don't have the privilege of being connected to the agriculture production system. But we also know that if we want to take anything to policymakers, we have to have the backing of the beef industry, those agriculture economists, and the temporary foreign worker program. They're integral to the legitimacy and sharing the trust of the work that we do. So that's why we've chosen a qualitative approach, a visual. Ideally, we aim to integrate our CLD model into the short-term undercapacity dynamic input-output studio model. And the aim that we hope that we can use this to help the policymakers understand what the options could be for minimizing the ripple effect when we face the next future zoonotic. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. This is a quick look at what the literature said. I'm doing just a simple word search in all of the journals under these categories. Very similar. Again, they're written from the perspective of the academics, and there's not a lot of data that was available to inform these. The next slide is what I've come up with for the most common themes that are now being put in the literature. And as you can see, Jill Hobbs is the most recent in the CABI review, the adaptive resilience. So as the information comes up, we're able to assess. In agriculture, a lot of these other areas are not published yet. The timing of the outbreak was in March. If that would have been in, for example, in September 2021, we would be telling a different story. There was very little cattle feed available. The system was already, even without a pandemic, our cattle industry is struggling this year because of the lack of feed. The pandemic hit us in March, April, May, June. The cattle could go to pasture. We could at least keep them alive. Again, a lot of the literature is suggesting that we should, because of the small number of very large firms, that made the problem so much worse. Other people will counter that. The ag economist is saying there is an economies of scale that's at play. Consumer preferences very much influenced how the products that were on the shelves. We also know that new digital ways of ordering and delivering connecting farmers. So for example, one Saskatchewan entrepreneur invented something called Meatocracy, connecting right from the beef cattle ranch to the Regina consumer. Again, we mentioned before, temporary foreign workers. In the United States, as well as Canada and Germany, the literature is documented that communication and languages was key. The wages were increased. The employees in Canada, at least, were paid sick leave. Transportation, because they shared accommodations, were adapted to prevent shared car travel. Because of the communities, or as taking a word from Chris Cotton, we're looking at cultural enclaves. Those temporary foreign workers form a community. And that community then has shared celebrations, propagating it further because of their household situation, not just their work environment. No need to go over with you all the policy, the firms that had to put in all the different measures to protect their employees were given compensation packages to offset the cost. So again, the outbreaks and clusters appeared around the world, not just at the Alberta plants. The life cycle of beef makes it very different than other animals. The inequity gaps is something that's also being reported in literature and the accessibility of food. We have no evidence yet of that in Canada, specifically for beef. Here again, this is the really important point, looking forward into how we have our industrial food production system that gives us excellent quality and affordable food. Our causal loop diagram. So this is an introduction of the visual for basically what we're trying to and what we will actually deliver. So it's very exciting. So bear with me because it's not nice and neat and linear. This is fuzzy. So think of a causal loop diagram as a snapshot in time of the relationships that matter. It's the big picture. It's qualitative. You identify the important components by your own tacit knowledge or what you found in literature. Then you think about the linear, non-linear relationships and the feedback loops. It is a system. And the next picture that I'm going to show you, it's a very messy, fuzzy system. But the important thing about the causal loop diagram is the stakeholders. And so the stakeholders for our industry in Canada are the beef industry stakeholders, but they're also the temporary foreign workers, employees, as well as all the public health agency. We will try and identify the tipping points. What leverage points were there for high impact and low impact? Kind of the low-hanging fruit concept to implement that ripple effect, system-wide changes. When we have it available, we use quantitative data. And then that could be used for policymakers for nice and neat stocks and flows. This is what is coming out of the literature. This is a wicked problem perspective of COVID-19. And it was important for me to put this picture up because it shows us in green the economic piece, the environment piece, the health piece, the social piece, and the interventions piece. Beautiful alignment with everything that One Society Network is about. This is their conceptualization, Sahin et al., of the causal loop diagram for COVID-19. Not specific to the food supply system. That's going to be our job, to put a section, basically layer into this. And that's what the other authors are doing. They're taking this basic framework and they're layering individual immunity as a part of a CLD. This is our conceptualization draft of a section that would be added to the One Society Network, larger systems impact of CLD. So working from left to right, first I'll focus on what we don't have yet, and the policymakers could. So you could have the nice basic stocks and flows number from the beef cattle price and supply cow calf. You could have this packer numbers there, and then you can have the consumer numbers. So those three would be data that could be created later, and then policymakers could have access to that. Statistics Canada, nice visualization, that interactive dashboard is a very awesome first step. In green is our production cycle. So again, you've got the different phases, the cow-calf producer. The blue arrows show the directionality of the flow and whether it's positive or negative impact on the system. The breaks are basically a pause in the system or a delay. So here I'm going to take you through to the focus, the meat processing plant. So the meat processing plant, the feedback or the relationship with the employees and the meat processing plant. And this is where the pause is when the employees got sick and the plant was shut down. When the plants were shut down, that caused the pause to the wholesaler, which caused the pause in the relationship to the hotel and restaurant, the retailers, and then the consumers. And then the consumer, the feedback loop or the feedback relationship goes back to the hotel because there was less demand for steak, for example, for higher cuts of meat. And I'll draw your attention to the bottom where we did see a shift with digital technologies to connecting the farm to fork by direct retailing. The feedlots bore the brunt of the cost of the backlog, and the numbers of the backlog, to give you an example, remember 61.68 million from April to September is what it cost our feedlots to keep those animals alive and healthy. The peak of the backlog in Alberta for the West federally inspected plants were 141,000 head that needed to be kept alive and fed. We have engaged the beef supply chain experts. We are still connecting with the temporary foreign worker and the food processing industry. We have acquired industry trade statistics as we presented the backlog data. We did the initial literature review, but now since the 2022 publications are starting to appear, there's actually a lot of follow-up information that's coming on specific cases like Germany, like France, like Australia, USA, and they are looking specifically at case outbreak investigations and the data associated with the employees at the major meat processing plants. For example, in USA, there's a lovely study from Nebraska. And in Germany, their largest meat processing plant that was shut down has done some very detailed contact tracing. We developed a logic model, which we presented to our Science Advisory Council, and the literature review, we're starting to source for identifying those variables in that larger CLD model. So again, in a narrow sense, then we'll be looking at specifically at the processing plants in Alberta and beef. So I alluded to, we're starting to identify the variables, map the relationships, figure out the reinforcing and balancing feedback loops. This again is we need a lot of industry participation, and then identify the leverage intervention points, the policymakers, where they can make a difference to the ripple through the system. We want to preempt those unintended consequences. We were very fortunate that this was not a foodborne zoonotic disease. Critical review is important for any CLD model, and again, have that set up as a framework for stocks and flows. So we're hoping that this webinar gives our OSN team a bit of an introduction to the agriculture sector and specifically beef. There's a beautiful story to tell for Canada, and I think Jill Hobbs has described it well based on evidence. We have a scenario of adaptive resilience, but there are so much areas that need further investigation. So that concludes our introductory webinar. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. It has been the job of myself and Cheryl and Jake to pull this together. And we couldn't have done it without the people here listed on the screen. And we're very grateful for their help. Brenna Grant at CanFax Research Services put together this amazing backlog data. Christine has been able to connect us with a researcher at University of Calgary who will be looking specifically at one of the Alberta processing plants. Deborah Howard, now retired Canadian Agriculture Human Resource Council, was a great start for helping us understand the temporary workers program. And Suzanne Raymond kindly looked after the video and did a vetting of our slide deck. And Aaron J. over at the video is well connected for understanding the nuances of the coronavirus and active in the work there. And lastly, Annie Peck, who we ran this past for the Canadian Cattle Association. We do have a bibliography available.
Thanks very much, Joanne, and thanks, Cheryl, too. It's a great presentation, a lot of richness and depth there. There is a question, and I guess I'd encourage others. We've got a few minutes for other questions. If you have them, please use the Q&A box and fire them in there. But the question that we've got in front of us is actually referring to early on in your talk. You were describing change in imports, and the question is, where did the significant increase in imports come from? The U.S.? Didn't the U.S. face similar production problems?
Statistics Agriculture Canada did not allude to any of that. It's just a blanket number. The best I can tell you is the cuts of meat. So the beef products are an aggregate, and then it's subdivided into a few other, so that the cuts of meat as well as the beef products as an aggregate and live exports. It does not necessarily tell me the destinations at this point. That data would be available, but like I said, it does break it down into the modes of transportation, not the destinations.
Okay, great. And, I think that the second part of that question is also an interesting one in thinking about how did the US system do compared to the Canadian system. Maybe that's an interesting study down the road, which system was more resilient.
That's a very interesting question, because based on the literature only, not the public policy discourse that has been in the news press, the academic literature is suggesting, again, back to how labor force is handled. In many ways, the Canadian plants have a very different system, even if they share a similar ownership. The temporary foreign worker program puts a very big requirement on our employers. So in terms of the consumer preferences shift US to Canada, the literature basically is suggesting similar trends. So more home cooking as the restaurants closed, but not to the time duration extent that we saw in Canada.
All right, interesting. Thanks.
Just a quick question from the health perspective. Are the processing plants, do they have their own kind of healthcare facilities on site, or are they highly dependent upon, in Alberta, for example, AHS and so what's the alignment between the sites and access, the processing facilities and access to healthcare facilities, and are there? And
may I assume that you're specifically alluding to the Alberta plants?
Yeah,
So from what has been reported in literature, I do believe that the two large plants have their full contingent of occupational health and safety that is documented in the literature, albeit mostly press articles and Alberta Health Services, that there was a real strong connectivity there between Alberta Health Services and the occupational health and safety plant people at those two plants. So in one article, for example, it was nurse practitioner level type of support on site. But that's the best that I can speak to.
Well, thanks for that. That's really helpful to understand that, and thanks for a great presentation. It was just a lot to digest in order to understand
the complex system.
Yeah, and I'd like to actually go home and digest a steak now after watching that video so many times.
There we go. All right. Any other questions? Last chance. Let's see. Okay. There's more of a comment. One more model that may be of interest in the future are Bayesian networks. So Bayesian networks in trying to address the system, I think. I'm not sure if you want to respond to that or not, but that's
Cheryl, you probably can. For now, I'm just thinking that, Bayesian is based on a predictive principle that you need to have some solid data in order to create the certain baseline and then do some inferences from there. But I mean, just generally speaking, yeah, that would be a very interesting possibility.
I just have to support what Joanne just said. One of the issues that we're dealing with right now, and one of Joanne's biggest challenges, just trying to figure out, once we get this mapped out, where we have data and where we don't, and where we can potentially make some inferences and where we might not be able to. So that's why the deliverable for this was very much limited to the causal loop diagram, with the potential to take it farther in the future if there's an opportunity, depending on what types of data are actually available and where the information gaps actually are. Certainly, Bayesian networks are one possibility. Another, we also work very heavily with systems dynamics models and agent-based models as well, and then process models. So basically, the whole suite of complex system tools here could be considered. And I think that's the important take-home message. And Vic certainly echoed that we are dealing with a complex system here. And we need to make sure that we recognize that as we pull our data together. So no, thanks very much for the opportunity to share this today. And just thank you, Joanne, for pulling this all together.
Very good. Thanks very much, Cheryl and Joanne. So let me wrap up our session for today. So again, thanks to our presenters. Really fascinating seminar and a lot of depth and detail and richness. And just a reminder that the next One Society Network seminar is May 19th. You can click on the Society's webpage, and there's in the chat box is the overview. It's going to be on applications of mathematical modeling and epidemiology to pandemic evaluation. So it could be a pretty broad interest to the group. And of course, if you wish to learn more about the One Society Network or collaborate, go to the webpage, onesocietynetwork.ca/partners, and have a look at the work that's going on, and we'll connect. Okay, I think that's all. So again, thanks for participating. Thanks for joining, those of you in attendance, and thanks to Cheryl and Joanne for presenting. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.